For now, we're going to end the morning session with some reflections on real-life experiences of poverty and unemployment, and they come courtesy of a senior policy lecturer, social policy lecturer at Stirling University, who specialises in welfare reform, inequality, poverty and employment services. Please welcome Dr. Sharon Wright.
Thank you. I've also just noticed that you could have said your introduction and has matched our trousers to the front table. What I'd like to do is start from a slightly different vantage point, and my main interest is in unemployment and transitions between unemployment and work. So what I'd like to do is set out an accurate context within which we can understand these issues. What we've learned so far today is that there's a lot of myths surrounding these areas. There's myths about third generation worklessness or poverty. There's myths around the underclass. But what is the accurate information that we need in order to understand these issues? I think what we need to do is look to the broader trends, find some facts, and also understand authentic lived experiences, just as the last paper has done. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is set out unemployment in an accurate context rather than a myth-fueled context, and establish the policy trends which include these important discrediting discourses that we've spent a bit of time thinking about already. I want to also just set out some practice trends around looking for work, and then present very briefly some findings from a small-scale study that I did recently, which was of people's experiences of receiving benefits and looking for work. And then I'm going to finish with a conclusion, just for fun, and think about what we might be able to do to challenge poverty, since this is part of Challenge Poverty Week. Here's a nice graph. We always like some graphs, they're good for facts. This shows claimant unemployment in the UK between 1950 and 1997. Any observations? What does this show us? Shout out at will. I know this will mess with the recording, but... So it starts at 1950 and it sort of bumbles along here, and then starts to rise in the 70s. And then those, the big bit there, that's the 80s, then there's a dip, and then early 90s, another peak again. What does that show us? Recession effect. Yep, recession effects. This is what I show to my students, and I give them a real hard time. So what makes a difference then in terms of causes of unemployment? Yes, the economy. So for quite a while now, governments have been saying that unemployment and worklessness is caused by people's laziness or people's inability to look for jobs. If that's the case, it's quite a major coincidence that laziness should have breakout at the exact same time as recession. Another thing that this shows us is that in the post-war period, during the 50s and 60s, unemployment was really low, so it was about 5%, and it stayed low for a really stable amount of time. Then recessions led to peaks in unemployment over, first of all, over 2.5 million, and then over 3 million people. Where we are now and what's happened in the last decade can also now be mapped on top of here, because this finishes in 97. So this blue line here shows the first quarter of 2008. That's the level that unemployment was at before the recent recession. Very low. It had been low for a decade. So it had been around 5% most of the time since New Labour came to power. That's the context in which New Labour's welfare reforms were introduced. Really stable, low unemployment, which has only been similar to that in the direct post-war period. It gets better. Are you ready? That's the last quarter of 2008. As the recession starts to hit, unemployment goes up and rises above the 1 million mark. And there's 2013. That's what's happened now. So very rapidly, there's been a major increase in unemployment. What's the cause of that, do you think? Again to you. Yes! The economy, I would suggest, has caused this. Sorry? Maybe. So let's look at that in context. Pre-recession, employment rates were at a record high. This is something that not a lot of people seem to realise, because Blair was so keen to establish the need for more people to get into jobs. In the late 90s, Blair was saying that we needed to have an 80% unemployment rate and set out welfare reforms to get hundreds of thousands of disabled people and lone parents into work. What he didn't mention was that employment rates in the UK at that time were at a record high. So the UK peaked in 2008 at 74.9%. To put that in international context, the UK was one of only 5 EU 27 countries to maintain a rate above 70%. We already had very high employment rate, and it had been very high for a decade. Scotland was even better. Yes. Our employment rate was 76% in 2007, and it outperformed most other rich nations even after recession in 2008. So are we a country that has a problem with people getting jobs? No, we're not. When the economy's fine, people want to work, people get jobs. So this shows that myths about worklessness are very ill-founded, and politicians have deliberately shaped discourse to create a problem that didn't really exist. The economic crisis, the economy, led to UK recessions and a prolonged downturn. That triggered 2.7 million redundancies between 2008 and 2013, and obviously impacted on the overall number of jobs available and on the type of jobs. Unemployment was created on a scale not witnessed for a generation. You've seen that from the graph before. It's really unfamiliar for us to have unemployment at such a high level. So in 2013, there are 5.1, I don't know who the 0.1 is, unemployed people chasing each vacancy. So literally, there are not enough vacancies for the number of people looking for them by quite some way. In that context, how can we interpret the current government's instruction to people that they need to find a job? It seems, I don't know, I might suggest even cruel or perverse to tell people on threat of very tough sanctions that they must find a job when it's very clear that there are not enough jobs for the people looking for them. So the policy trends have been reasonably consistent since the late 1990s. The Labour government, like the coalition government now, has been interested in reducing entitlements. The value of benefits has reduced, of course, since the post-war period. Benefits have never been worth enough to keep out of poverty. So below poverty levels of benefits have declined further, and they're on track to be worth less and less relative to the cost of living and relative to earnings for the future years. Benefit caps have been introduced, and there's been an extension and intensification of conditionality. So policies have been changed to focus on individuals and to tell individuals that their behaviour is the problem and that it's their individual responsibility to look for a job and to find a job. Behaviour change has become much more important in government policy, and it's backed up, especially increasingly, through universal credit, through very tough sanctions of up to 3 years without benefits for not looking for a job. But another important thing to relate this to is that unemployment is still required by our economy. So there's a thing called the NAIRU. Have you heard of that? Nod or shake your heads. It stands for Non-Accelerated Inflation Rate of Unemployment. What this is an economic assumption that our current economists and since the 1980s, those who believe in monetarism, hold as important for the way the economy functions. So they say that in order for inflation to stay low and not get out of hand, it is necessary for unemployment to exist. And it's necessary for unemployment to exist at such a level that we don't create further economic difficulties. It's deemed by those in power that unemployment must exist. And there's been no rethink of boom time policies for austerity context. So in that context, welfare reforms have been put forward using very strong stigmatising anti-welfare rhetoric. There's a blanket view of benefit recipients as naturally inactive and in need of activation because the underlying assumption is they're either incompetent or immoral. This is, of course, historically inaccurate, as we've already heard today, and part of the story that policymakers tell from Blair onwards is that previous benefit systems were so-called passive, that they allowed people to claim benefits without making it enough of a contribution. That's not true. Unemployment benefits have always required people and expected people to look for jobs. But this story about changing policies, changing welfare reforms to encourage people to become active through looking for paid work is very, very powerful. And part of that power is because it robs us of the power to conceive of things in any other way. We need an alternative. So that's the broad policy trends have been towards making life difficult for people. At the same time, there have been changes in practices. So I'm interested in the transitions between being out of work and getting a job. Obviously, those are quite complex processes. But what's been happening in terms of support for people looking for jobs is also not very great. So if you compare the sorts of employment services we have in the UK with other countries in Europe or Scandinavia or America or the rest of the English-speaking world, we have a type of employment support system that is like maybe Walmart. It's the low-cost end of what you could do to help people look for work. It's based on work first. It's based on telling people they need to look for jobs. And for most people, that's highly effective. 9 out of 10 people do find a job before they become long-term unemployed, so within the first 6 months they've been out of work. But they do that on their own pretty much. It's a self-help model, and that idea of how we support people in looking for work has progressed along the line that the more we require people to look for work, the less help they get in doing so. So reform of Job Centre Plus over the last few years has explicitly been aimed at minimising footfall. What that means is discouraging people to go to local offices to speak to an advisor. The main routes for getting help to look for work are online. You could look at the web to apply for vacancies, or you could maybe phone up at your own cost to try to speak to an advisor. Also, intensive help for people who have got more needs, people who've been out of work for longer, people with particularly difficult challenges to find a job, have been outsourced mainly to private companies, also involving third sector agencies. Now, it's quite interesting here, if you look at the evaluation evidence, this is not what harsh critics say, this is what the government's own evaluation evidence shows of these programmes. First of all, the National Audit Office says that work programme targets were over-ambitious. They thought more people would be moved into work than has been possible. They've also failed to meet minimum service standards. In the first phase, that was for all types of people looking for work. In the second phase, it's been slightly more successful for job seekers, less successful for disabled people and lone parents. One of the biggest challenges for supporting people to look for work is that there's not very much that's allowed in the system. So there's been a lot of talk about the black box of delivery, personalised, tailor-made services for job seekers. But when you look at how that operates in practice, the official evaluation evidence shows that personalised help is undermined by the computer system which pre-programs responses. So when there's an interview between someone looking for work and the advisor, they can talk about lots of different options, but the advisor has to click a certain thing on their computer screen and their pre-structured responses. Also, users can be asked to engage in inappropriate or irrelevant activities or to enter unsuitable employment. There's also recent research that shows that welfare to work advisors adopt elements of this anti-welfare discourse. And I suppose that's part of what has been shown in the other papers as well. It's not just a case of politicians having strong myths about third-generation worklessness. Frontline practitioners are maybe the strongest proponents of that sort of idea. So what I want to do now is just show you some quotes from some people that we interviewed. This research was done in 2008, and it was just a small piece of work. We interviewed 16 benefit recipients about what it's like to receive benefits and look for work. And we asked them about the sorts of advice services that they received. What's interesting is that the discourse and the policy design of the last, at least decade, focuses very much on individual choice and control. It says that we are in control of our own biographies, that if we lose our job or if our partner leaves us, we become a lone parent, for example, that's our responsibility, that we are in control of our lives and we choose whether or not we claim benefits or look for work. Well, we asked questions about that, and Janet, who's a homeless disabled lone parent, let's just think about that for a minute, a homeless disabled lone parent who not only looked after her son but also cared for her mother with dementia, said, "I don't think I feel in control. Had I felt in control, I could do something about the situation." The story that we heard from all of the participants was that they didn't find that they had control or choice about the situations they ended up in. They didn't want to claim benefits. They tried everything they could to avoid it. They wanted to work. All of them wanted to work. But many of them were not in situations that made it possible. It was also common amongst all the participants that they found getting by on benefits a struggle. So Janet says it's like a fight with a huge monster, and you're always scared that you're buried alive again. Sometimes I can't breathe when I think about it. It's like reaching for help and you can't even feel the tips of the other fingers touching you. Sometimes all that confidence, all that I gained, it's like swallowing me. So the daily experience of claiming benefits and looking for work, and the daily experience of living in poverty could be very challenging. And she also highlighted a core problem with current welfare reform design, which says the answer is look for a job. She said, "I'm saying to the government, here, listen to me. I want to get a job. I don't want your benefits. I don't want them. I want to get a job and lead my life." The problem in her situation was not any lack of desire. It wasn't any lack of self-development. She was a strong woman. She was clear about what she wanted. She was taking every effort possible to find a job, and yet she couldn't. So current policy doesn't really recognise that you can be active and still not have the desired or approved outcome. So then that raises a question for us. Is policy enabling, or could policy, in fact, for some people in some circumstances, lead to or compound their disempowering? Again, Janet says, it's a lot of a load. The rent is £1,200 per month. That was because she was in temporary homeless accommodation. She'd been housed in for 3 years, so it wasn't really, not so temporary. She says, I'm a woman who wants to go to work. I want to get a job, but I'm so scared because if I go, when I get a job, I'm going to be depressed because of all that money I have to pay. And he, the personal advisor, said, well, you know it all. We can't do anything about that. So I left the job centre again with another brick of the wall piling up in front of me. Her own ability to change her situation met with a brick wall. So we can also look at what employment services or advice services are actually able to do. Certainly, there were examples of very good practice, and people had felt empowered and helped by the whole range of services that we included, including Job Centre Plus, through to informal services. But there is a dynamic at the heart of this. There's a dynamic at the heart of policy that's telling people, representing people in a way that's inaccurate. It's misrepresenting people's motivations and the sort of realities of the lived experience. So Dave, an unemployed man, said, it was really, really difficult, and I just felt, that I just didn't matter. Jasvinder said they at Job Centre Plus don't really care what I'm trying to say. It really doesn't matter what you're saying. So if you design policies that are based on a misunderstanding of the problem and a misrepresentation of the very people that they're meant to help, is that really activating, or in fact, can it be devaluing? In conclusion, current welfare reforms are disconnected from the lived experiences of poverty, families and unemployment. Political discourse and debate regularly and repeatedly misrepresent the people and places subject to intervention. The basic problem is that policy design misdiagnoses the problem and falsely prescribes the cure. That's nothing new. This is a problem that policymakers have had for centuries. If you look back at the poor laws and the workhouses of the 19th century, they made the same mistakes, or at least very similar mistakes, in thinking that what the problem was lazy men who were able-bodied. That's not the problem. There's something bigger that needs an effective cure or an effective intervention. And I want to argue that in order to have effective policies, we need to base them on authentic accounts of lived experience rather than myths. And that authentic lived experience involves relative powerlessness, and it involves collapses in ability to be assertive. So policies argue that, or are based on assumptions that we each are able to be enlightened or assertive, that we can make changes in our lives, and that we choose one way or the other about what we do. But when you really look closely at people's accounts of being on benefits and looking for work, it's clear that people fluctuate between different states. Sometimes they feel strong and assertive and they're able to make choices, but those choices can be affected really fundamentally by others, so by the influence of individual others or by their experience of broader systems. So for example, we interviewed a lone parent whose partner quite commonly wasn't paying maintenance. So she experienced oppressive policy design and was also affected by what her ex-partner had done, his own choices and his own control, I guess, if you view it that way. Lived experience also involves effort and self-development, but that's not enough. It's not just about effort and self-development. You can have as much effort as you like and develop yourself as much as you can, but that doesn't mean you can necessarily find a job when there isn't one. There are systems and processes which are beyond individual control and individual choice. Now, this next point is a little bit complex. So there's a sociologist called Anthony Giddens who's argued that the goal for citizens should be self-actualization. Giddens was an important policy advisor to Tony Blair. The policies that have been designed recently emphasise personal responsibility, but I'm arguing that these policies themselves can undermine the necessary, what Giddens calls ontological security, inner confidence and self-respect. How much self-respect can you have if policy misrepresents your motivations and misrepresents your actions? Conditional welfare policies can also deactivate. So finally, what can we do about it? I think it's interesting to talk about what policymakers can do about it. It's interesting to talk about what politicians and civil servants can do. But really, when you get down to it, each of us is complicit in this situation unless we challenge it. So I think that each of us, can insist on accurate, respectful and dignified public discussion of poverty, families and unemployment. That's the same point that was made earlier. If you hear someone talking about third-generation homelessness, you can tell them that's not true. You can encourage respect and dignity and not allow discounting or devaluation of self or others. If you see things in the press or on Channel 5, you can complain about them. And I would encourage you to do that. Because these sort of prevalent condemnatory judgments that are made by the media and by powerful organisations and individuals, they're out there and they're having an influence, and it's up to us here now to challenge that. We can also campaign for policy change that's based on authentic evidence, accurate context, and lived experience. All of us can challenge poverty.
Thanks very much indeed, Sharon. This particular malevolent corner of the media would like to pinch a couple of minutes out of your lunch break just to give you a chance to put some questions to Sharon if you have them. Is that okay with people? Are you all right with that? Anybody want to put any points? Dora, please. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mark Robinson. I work for NHS Health Scotland. It's just an observation on your earlier chart which showed trends in unemployment. And obviously in the boom years just prior to the economic recession in 2008, employment was high. And so I guess there's a perception that if people wanted a job during those years, then a job may have been available. But we recently published a study which actually looked at the inequalities in opportunity to work, both pre and post-recession. And even pre-recession, there were huge inequalities in terms of a mismatch between people or job claimants and jobs availability, particularly among the sort of more elementary occupations like cleaning and so on. So I guess it's just an observation that should the economy start growing again and more jobs become available, then it doesn't necessarily mean there'll be an even distribution of the availability of those jobs.
Yeah.
Sorry, somebody else just wanted to pick up on the same point, I think, yeah?
Just like Mark did, just really a comment there, and it was this thing about under the Blair government, the record levels of employment. And I think there's some nuance or different dimensions to that. The nature of a lot of that, or the structure of a lot of that employment is arguably part of the problem of where we are at now. Very, very large amounts of public expenditure, big growth in public sector, and more importantly, a lot of public funded work. There was, for instance, in the UK, a very large body, because at one point I was part of it, of professionals who were very well resourced and funded to parachute into what were designated as deprived areas and regenerate them. As soon as the public money, of course, it was challenged in a period of recession, the private sector simply moved on. The public sector shrank. And they've left virtually no legacy. I'm not aware of any single example in the UK of a sustained economic regeneration of a deprived area. And that's left us very much in this situation that we are in now. And I think the relevance now is this point about we need to be careful about the structure of what kind of employment we want to get back to, because arguably we're almost there. It's the nature of what that employment is. And we need to get the whole poverty agenda injected right into the mainstream of the debate about the UK and the Scottish economy. Where is it going? Where are the areas of growth? Can we end the domination of the Metro London financial elites? And can we actually rebalance our economy?
Okay, Sharon.
Just a few small issues then.
Discuss, as they say in exams. Yeah.
Yeah, on the first point, I absolutely agree. It's about the distribution of jobs. And another thing that I was going to do, but there wasn't enough time to have a slide on this, was talk more about what does work actually mean, what does paid employment mean? Because we also have to acknowledge that a very important part of that context is labour market inequality. So just because we had the highest ever rates of jobs before the recession doesn't mean we had equality in the labour market, far from it. Of course, we have very big differences between, for example, men and women, people from different ethnic groups, people of different ages and geographical regions. There's definitely big sort of fault lines in the labour market. And also, the world of work has changed, so the type of jobs that are available now are not the type of jobs that were available 30 years ago. It's much more common to have temporary jobs, 0 hours contracts, insecure employment, and that cycle between low pay and no pay. So certainly I wouldn't suggest that all was well with the labour market before we had a recession. And there is a mismatch between the type of jobs that people are looking for and the type of jobs that are available. And we're not just talking about sort of low-skilled jobs. It could be, for example, in healthcare. And then that creates quite an interesting problem for employment services at Job Centre Plus, for example. If you're talking to a qualified nurse and instructing her on threat of a 3-year benefit sanction that she must take up a cleaning job, then there's something to worry about there. It's not a great solution. So the distribution of jobs is important. And then the second series of points. yeah, the nature of work is important. And I think somewhere in there you said economic regeneration doesn't work. There's also been some really interesting work by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which looked at places, including places in Scotland, and highlighted the historical legacy. Just like health inequalities are sort of very old, centuries long, they affect particular areas.
What's the alternative to economic regeneration if it doesn't work? I mean, there were figures come out this week saying that Bathgate has finally got back the jobs in number terms that it lost when the Leyland plant went. It's taken a long time. It wasn't dynamic, but if you hadn't done anything, what would have happened?
That's a big question.
No, sorry.
Yeah, we need jobs. You can't end unemployment without jobs. Yeah. But then there's another question as well, can you ever end unemployment? And maybe that's something for our discussions this afternoon, because certainly the economy requires some degree of unemployment. But that's very strongly patterned in geographical areas. There is also a severe penalty for disabled people in terms of looking for work, and that's been calculated by Richard Berthoud, who shows that after the recession, it's become even more difficult for people who are disabled to find work than it was before.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Would you join me in thanking Sharon Wright?